in the paper we began with a bit of a historical reference because we think it's important to look at our history when thinking about where we are and where we think we should be ahead. So why don't I use a reference to this marvellous building that's before us, Trades Hall. At street level, near the ground, you'll notice the foundation stone that was laid. This building was put down by Labor Prime Minister Andrew Fisher. I happened to read a biography of his some years ago, and a couple of snippets stuck in my mind. As a teenager in Scotland, he was urged by his family and took the lifelong pledge not to drink alcohol. And it's obviously not a tradition we're continuing here, but he went on to, in fact, found a coal mining union in Western Queensland, and his first draft of the Constitution it sought to make it mandatory for officials of that union to be ineligible for office unless they had taken the lifelong pledge. He was unsuccessful in that effort, and although one suspects if this had become more widely adopted, a lot of problems for us might have been solved before they arose. Why am I banging on about this? Back in Arthur Fisher's day, the foundational campaign, complete with a 3-word slogan, was the 8-hour day. 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours recreation. Labor historian from Western Australia, Lenore Lehman, I got to interview a little while ago, and she corrected a misunderstanding that we have contemporarily about the word recreation. A century ago, it was more rightly understood as to recreate. So think of those mechanics institutes and the civil society organisations that unions were so important to, that working class people, we needed to re-educate ourselves. And we began in our paper with that reference because that's the spirit in which we put forward this discussion. We believe we need to relive that spirit of recreation, and now is a good time to do that. And nobody has the right answers, certainly not Tim and I, but we're trying to pose a few questions, and the main one that we're trying to pose in the paper for us to be thinking about is what role can or should unions be playing in the years ahead to be better positioned to advance the goal that we all share for greater equality. The other thing to sort of keep in mind with our perspective is that it comes from a labour movement perspective. So we talk a bit about both the unions and the Labor Party as our partner. Now, it's not to belittle other progressive parties like the Greens, but the simple truth of the matter is if we want to be strategic, we have to encompass government and public policies to bring about the changes that we need. And for that, for the foreseeable future, means our partnership with the Labor Party is important, and maybe even more so. That 8-hour day theme that helped found the labour movement was in no way confused about how work and life are meshed together. And part of our theme is that some of that understanding is a bit lost in a way that we think needs to be thought about again. A reference that we have into the book is by a guy who went on to become an academic. He was actually a strategic research person with a union, the AMW, about 30 years ago, Andrew Scott. And he wrote a publication called Fading Loyalties, which I read at the time, and it's always stuck in my mind, and I insisted that it go in here too, which was that he argued that the concepts of blue and white collar were dangerous ones for us to be thinking about, that working people, by and large, can be divided between those for whom work is a means to having a life, gives you the income to raise a family or engage in other activities, religious or sporting or recreational, however defined, and those for whom work is actually central to their lives, part of our self-identity. And that is a more helpful way of looking at how working people engage with life, because you adopt a different approach to how they engage with that. Now, of course, what's been happening over these 100 years, of course, while one of the clarion calls for the Change the Rules campaign is Australia needs a pay rise, and indeed we do, but actually in the long run, material well-being has actually been rising. For most working people, they have a greater capacity to act upon the things they value in life, which are not their jobs, but the other things in their lives. And so that part of their world has become relatively more important, albeit at a time when possibly unions are focused even more on work and work alone. Think of the gender pay gap. Really, since we won a legal battle about, comparing the wages for same work and it's unlawful, it's become more obvious that what underpins the gender pay gap is both women being segregated into occupations and industries that have traditionally been paid less, but also the women socially expect of themselves and others expect of them to undertake unpaid work in primarily caring and domestic home duties. In other words, it's that part of life that has constrained the opportunities for women as much as work. So I think it's a useful concept between, work as life or work as a means to life in thinking about unionists as well. Even a union official or a union employee in the most working class of unions, most of them, that is part of their self-identity. They go around and they'll proudly parade, their values being expressed through their work. And that is actually different from how their members view it. And I've seen more than a few officials kind of with a glinter in their eye of Labor values proclaiming loudly to groups that are not quite as rusted on about it, and it's because they have a different relationship to work. Of course, our partner in the Labor Party has a more explicit role in having to engage the community more broadly than unions, but also more broadly than work, because it has to stitch together a majority, and also when in governing needs to have policies not only on workforce relations but also around health services and sporting and recreational, the arts, community safety and the like. So our agenda, if it's narrowly defined around work, can and should contest with those other asks. But of course, Labor is not in government as often as we might want it to be. And day to day, working people, their best defence remains unions, and our capacity to bargain for improved pay and conditions has been constrained in many serious ways of late. And this is the point where I'm going to invite Tim to sort of talk about some of those issues as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. And look, I'll just say that when I do presentations like this, normally what I have is a nice PowerPoint with a lot of charts behind it. We don't have that, so just imagine that whenever I make a really great point, there's also an amazing chart behind me that completely proves it, and no further correspondence will be entered into. Okay. So, so continuing on from where Phil was talking about, the capacity of unions to essentially improve people's lives, as he mentioned, has been constrained. And some of that constraint does come from what you might call broader political and social developments. It's fair to say around the Western world, union membership is down. There are lots of places where traditionally high union membership has sort of shrunk over roughly the same period of time as it has in Australia. But what I would also say is that, of course, some of the constraints on unions' abilities to deliver better lives for their members are also about specific changes or specific barriers that we've more or less inflicted upon ourselves. And have inflicted them upon ourselves through various economic reforms that unions have, it has to be said, supported when governments of the Labor variety have been in office. And some of that now there's a broad debate about how well or how badly those things have worked out for the labour movement and working people. Certainly, as Phil says, if you want to look at the broad metrics of better life, Australia does have a considerably better life for most people most of the time. But we still have a system that allows a persistence of poverty that really hasn't been eradicated, and that poverty takes on a dimension that will often hit the people who are outside of, if you like, the classical union world. So to put it one way, at the moment what unions do is we have a system called enterprise bargaining. This more or less ensures that bargaining has to take place at the firm level. It has to take place at the company level. It has to take place in a very small world, a small world of people who largely have what you might call full-time work, who might have sort of relatively protected or permanent work, and who are also sort of sufficiently organised and have a sufficient occupational identity and sort of perhaps industry identity in order to allow them to come together to actually sort of effectively advocate on their own behalf through their unions naturally. But it's increasingly clear that there's a whole world of work that's actually outside of all that. And it's a world of work that unions are not specifically set up to represent. If you're looking at sort of low-wage workers in the private sector, working for small or even medium-sized firms, unions as they're currently set up are really not in a position to bargain for them effectively, certainly not in a way that sort of you would call collective bargaining. It's even worse in what you might call, I'll politely call the informal sector, but you could reasonably say is also the black market in labour, and essentially a situation in which exploitation, underpayment, sometimes what's been called recently modern slavery, although slavery itself certainly isn't modern. All of those areas are places where bargaining doesn't reach, where the notion of sort of a collective organisation collectively bargaining on behalf of people just can't reach those areas. What those sorts of workers are often on, and you know, they're often female, they often come from migrant backgrounds, often people who are what they call culturally and linguistically diverse. You're often talking people who are here perhaps on backpackers visas, people who are here on guest worker schemes, people who are on bridging visas, possibly while their refugee status is being resolved or has been resolved in a particular way. These are places, these are workers where bargaining doesn't reach. Instead, what you find is that unions themselves tend to act as effectively bargaining agents every few years for particular groups of carefully defined members. Every few years, you're working in a workplace, every few years a union will come along, okay, we're doing up a claim, this is what you want, this is what we suggest you want. They might do a survey, you want a certain amount of pay increase, you want a certain amount of, you want a certain changes to hours, all of those sorts of things. Union basically sets out to bargain with that. It may go smoothly, there may be issues, may even involve industrial action, although that doesn't happen as often as perhaps it should at the moment. And once that's resolved, however it's resolved, the pay increase, the hours change, whatever it is, then the union can tend to disappear. And the reason they disappear is because often the world of unions or the role of unions is highly constrained by legislation about matters pertaining to what's called the employment relationship. In law, this is very narrowly defined. So all of the aspects of, if you like, the broader life that you might expect, or at least in previous generations, other people have thought about or workers have thought about in terms of like recreating yourself, providing time off, providing life as well as work, All of these things are effectively legally excluded from the world of bargaining. And remember, the world of bargaining is where unions predominantly operate, but the world of bargaining itself has become smaller and I would argue in many ways more atrophied, specifically because some of those broader life-changing issues are simply excluded from consideration. Many times workers want to, or workers would want to discuss, for example, green measures, environmental measures in their industrial agreements. Your ability to actually do that through an industrial agreement is really quite limited. Some of it has expanded depending on changes in legislation, but broadly speaking, that's not a matter that pertains to the employment relationship, not a permitted matter. And so while the world of bargaining is kind of constrained, while the world of bargaining is stuck, if you like, within that particular sort of firm enterprise bargaining, matters pertaining to the employment relationship constraint, then the ability of unions to broadly represent growing areas of the workforce that simply fall outside of all that is going to become harder and harder. Last week, figures on union membership, and including what's called the union wage premium, were released. How much more union members are paid on average compared to others. And look, once again, as it often does, unions are earning, unionists earn roughly on average 20% more than non-unionists at any given time. Now that's often quoted as a success, but I would argue it's a highly ambiguous success, because the very fact that you can see a difference between what unionists are paid and what non-unionists are paid pretty much shows that those unionists must only operate within far, far smaller, more confined parts of the workforce. A truly successful union movement that had a broad support throughout the workforce should really reduce that union premium to a very low indeed, because their control of the labour market should be so tight, there should be no real difference between those. So wages are an ambiguous measure of success, while bargaining is in a confined and constrained world for unions.
I wanted to talk more about what all of this, or some of this, means for unions as organisations. So we're coming out of the Accord era. One of the organisational changes was the shift to unions amalgamating and becoming larger. And while union membership didn't decline directly as a result of the Accord, it was more a tipping point in the recession in the early 90s, and the consequences of the Accord in opening up a more free market economy, then membership declined. But as membership was declining as a proportion, unions were actually growing as organisations. They were bigger organisations with a relatively smaller membership. Also, the stakes in election for unions were higher because they were bigger. I mean, the stakes are always high. People forget our officials in unions are elected by their members, and they have insecurity in their employment. And so a number of things organisationally occur with unions. That'd be my beep to shut up. Which includes that most unions, all of their staff are members of that union. And so they're not members of the Australian Services Union, which is our union, and which does in fact claim to be the union that should be representing employees. And so it's not uncommon for employees in a union to have a direct stake in the elected official, and if there is a turnover, and mostly there is not turnover through elections, mostly leadership is occurring through a mentoring process. But if there is a contested change, the stakes are even higher because a number of employees are at risk as well. And this isn't healthy, it isn't democratic. Union elections might be a motor force for reform, but more often the avoidance of elections, are a reason for organisational conservatism. Now, contrast this with our partner, the Labor Party. It has been through a program of genuine organisational reform over some decades now. Two broad features stand out. One is enabling individual members to have a direct say in voting for a number of positions: federal leader, in WA our state leader, state president, national president. This enlivens party membership. We have a high turnout for vote. They're usually contested. As a lifelong member of the Labor Party and a lifelong member of the union movement, I get to vote in the last 10 years more in the Labor Party than I ever have through my union membership. The other standout success, of course, for the Labor Party has been our affirmative action policy. Screaming success by any measure. We've come close to having half of all of our parliamentary parties comprised of women. We have flipped around from an era about 20 or so years ago when men were more likely to vote Labor to now have women be more likely to vote Labor. It has helped us electorally, politically and organisationally. It gives us more confidence as a party that lives some of its values. And so I'm not at all pessimistic about the value that organisational reform can provide for unions as organisations, in part because of the success that we see with our partner in the party. I think we could define new roles for peak union bodies as well, but I'm not going to go into that here because of time. I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to talk about what were some of our ideas for an agenda for change before opening up for questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, since I grossly ran over my time, last time, I'll try and keep this much shorter and really just talk about something that I think it's a bit of a broad-ranging point because, of course, there is an agenda for change that the ACTU has been running on, and you can find that at australianunions.org.au. A number of changes to the industrial relations system that unions are going for. But I think more broadly what unions should be looking at is taking up some of those terms around innovation, around disruption, and all of those points that shall we say, capitalists insist on serving up to us as sort of the great new thing that we're going to be doing. We're going to be innovating, we're going to be disrupting. Often it can mean sort of new and exciting ways of making people work harder and make their lives more miserable. But I think that they're still good words. They're still good words. They're still interesting and challenging words. And I think that what the union movement can do is actually pick them up and make them something worthwhile and something that's really for the benefit of working people. And something that sort of goes with the grain, if you like, of unions and the way that they're supposed to operate are things that are collective. And there's a concept called the wealth of networks that's been around for the last decade or so. Essentially, a way by which we look at sort of wealth, opportunities, chances to grow, chances to sort of create wealth, if you like, don't come from sort of everybody madly competing with each other in the sort of the hamster wheel of the free market, but actually from people cooperating together. Actually people cooperating, building relationships, building networks. So your ability to create wealth out of that, and I'm using a very narrow economistic way of talking about this, your way to build wealth out of that comes not from your ability to compete with one another, but from your ability to complement one another. Now, unions are in many ways ideally placed to facilitate this precisely because they are collective organisations, and they are organisations that put a premium on people working together. We work together in specific ways. Going back to that sort of world of bargaining, if you like. But one of the ways in which we should expand our horizons, and certainly any changes to the law that we have should certainly work to this, expand our horizons to really complement that wealth of networks that we can create between people. And of course, I'm talking about this in terms of a if you like, an economic outcome. But what we really should be thinking about it as having a social outcome as well, and having an outcome that leads to a broader social change. What we should ideally be doing is creating structures that build those networks, build those links between people. These are not sort of subtractions from, if you like, the quote-unquote real economy or the quote-unquote broader economic growth. They are complements to all of those things, and indeed they are the only way forward if you look at the way that if you look at the way that neoliberalism has worked, or more to the point, the ways that neoliberalism hasn't worked. So I think that sort of broadly we should be thinking about, when we change the rules, when we change laws, when we change our own practices, when we change the way that unions work internally, we should be looking at ways, how do we build those wealth of networks rather than just sort of whether we've got a kind of more efficient accounting system sort of in the back room or anything like that. And so with that, are we concluded? I think we are. And that's it. Yes, sir. Build more networks.